Buongiorno a tutti, grazie per essere con noi oggi, per questo che è un seminario veramente molto, spero sarà un seminario molto interessante. Sicuramente il nostro ospite ha tante cose da dire. Abbiamo con noi Terence Kealey, che è di formazione uno scienziato, un chimico. Ha insegnato a lungo in diverse università, nonostante lui sia laureato a Oxford, ha insegnato a Cambridge e poi all'Università di Buckingham, di cui è stato Vice Chancellor, cioè rettore, per alcuni anni, con notevoli risultati rispetto alla crescita e al prestigio di quella università. Terence, che è un amico non da oggi dell'Istituto Bruno Leoni, si è molto occupato di questioni che riguardano il finanziamento della ricerca scientifica, prendendo spesso una posizione assai diversa da coloro che ritengono che la ricerca di base possa essere finanziata esclusivamente dallo Stato, e anzi sottolineando come invece accada sempre più frequentemente, scusate, che la ricerca sia finanziata da attori privati. Essendo uno scienziato ed essendo un esperto del modo in cui funzionano i sistemi di ricerca moderni, è la persona ideale e con la quale discutere di alcune delle dinamiche che abbiamo visto già all'opera rispetto alla reazione, al contenimento del coronavirus. In particolare Terence ha scritto qualche giorno fa un editoriale sul sito della CNN paragonando la risposta di alcuni paesi del Far East come Taiwan e come la Corea del Sud invece al genere di risposta che hanno dato perlomeno sin qui la più parte dei paesi occidentali. Il seminario sarà in lingua inglese, and so we'll switch to English. I just said very nice things about you, by the way. Don't worry about that. We're very pleased that you're here with us. The title of this conversation is Healing Markets. And as I mentioned, the idea comes out of a column of yours that was published on the CNN website, in which you somehow looked at the difference in response between some Far East governments and some Western governments. But I also mentioned in my introduction that you've been a very prominent critic of the idea that science ought to be financed by government. So I will just like to ask you, in what sense government financing of science is something that this crisis reveals as a problem or as an opportunity to do more, as some people argue. I mean, there have been quite a few people actually arguing for more nationalization in the pharmaceutical sectors, for example, to be sure that we have enough supplies of the medicines we need. That was on the paper in quite a few instances these days. But more broadly, more generally speaking, what we can learn in your perspective from the way in which South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore responded to the crisis. And once again, thank you so much for being with us today, Terence.
Well, thank you, Alberto. It's obviously lovely to be here. The really dramatic thing about this crisis with the coronavirus is the difference between South Korea, Taiwan, and other Eastern democracies who've handled the virus quite astonishingly well. I mean, Taiwan, for example, there are days that go by without a single new case. South Korea is not quite so dramatic, but by our standards, highly dramatic. Perhaps 100 new cases a day, perhaps 5 deaths. Obviously, every death is tragic, but compared to the situation in America or Northern Italy, where you are, or the United Kingdom, it's almost magical what happened in the Far East compared to what's happened to us in the West. And there are 2 days, January the 27th and January the 28th, that really illustrate with an almost astonishing clarity the difference of approach between those of the Far Eastern democracies and those of the Western democracies. On January the 27th, when South Korea had only 4 cases of the disease, the authorities called together the 20 leading biotech companies and asked them to develop a test for this new disease. The very next day, on January the 28th, an English think tank called Policy Exchange, very close to the Conservative government, issued a report called Visions of ARPA. I'm about to talk about it in a second, calling for essentially another £1 billion a year for the purest of English research. And in that 24-hour period.
Let's remind our participants what ARPA is.
I'm coming to that. Honestly, I am. I'll be dedicating a couple of minutes ago. It is just pure science. For now, let me just say the purest of science. And in those 24 hours, you see the difference between the Far Eastern approach to science and the Western approach to science. In the Far East, science, purpose of science is to serve society. In Britain and America, and I'm afraid Italy, the purpose of society is to serve science. And in that 24-hour period, just the 27th of January and the 28th of January, you see that illustrated beautifully. And the consequences, of course, we've all seen. So let me give a short timeline, and then I'll talk about these two different approaches. So on December the 31st last year, the last day of last year, the Chinese government told the World Health Organization they had a new disease. By the 10th of January, very quickly, a Chinese research group had published the sequence of the virus. And the whole point of an RNA sequence, which is what it was, is that it can be the basis of a test. On January the 27th, on January the 20th, sorry, South Korea had its first case. The next day, January the 21st, the States had their first case. And then a week later, January the 30th, the British had their first case. And then, as I've said, on January the 27th, the Korean government called together the biotech companies. Now that was January the 27th. By February the 4th, Cogene Biotech, one of the SEAL biotech companies, had already developed a test. By February the 10th, the first nearly 3,000 people were being tested by the Korean authorities with this new test. And the result of that was very simple. The infection never took off in countries like South Korea and Taiwan and other Far Eastern democracies because it was caught before it spread. So, of course, the initial diagnoses were made the usual way through clinical tests, but then they were tested with the virus, this new RNA-based test, and then patients were isolated, contacts were isolated, and as a consequence of that, no one needed to close down the economy, no one had to close down society. The individuals were put at home in the main until they had got better. And of course, ill people went to hospital, but the disease was stopped before it started. Look at the difference in England and America and Italy, where the disease was allowed to rip before the authorities even knew what had happened. Now, what is ARPA, you say, and why is this relevant? Very relevant. As I said, January the 27th, South Korean government asks the biotech companies to create a new test. January the 28th, Policy Exchange produces Visions of ARPA. Now, ARPA is a very interesting exercise. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. And Sputnik was the first artificial satellite, and it gave a terrible fright to the Americans, the whole Western world. And the decision was taken in Washington and London, and I expect also in Rome, that the Russians had discovered the secret to economic growth. If only we had a Soviet Union type science, then we could achieve the same fantastic success of the Soviet Union. That was the thinking. And one of the things, we had NASA came out in 1958, the year afterwards. This is America, of course. Defense Education Act, again, America. And also in 1958, ARPA. And that stands for Advanced Research Programs Agency. And the idea of ARPA was to model American science on that of the Soviet Union, as I said. And basically, it went to a group of scientists and said, you can do what you like, you can spend whatever sums of money you like, on whatever project you like, just do pure research, and we'll be grateful to you, oh wonderful scientists. And then a very important thing happened in America. It was called Project Hindsight. And Project Hindsight in 1969 was a study performed by the Defense Department, which pointed out that it was a complete myth. There were no benefits from the government funding of science. It was just a myth. And of course, the Soviet Union is not exactly an example anyone wanted to follow. And as a consequence of that, something very important happened. The government stopped funding ARPA to do pure science. ARPA then became DARPA with a D and was restricted only to applied science. And what did all those scientists at ARPA do? Because they were all sacked. They went to Silicon Valley, which was then, of course, not Silicon Valley, it was just a valley. And they worked for something called Xerox PARC, and they invented the personal computer. And everything that happened with Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, all that comes out of Xerox PARC, but only because ARPA in America was abolished. It was because the government was no longer funding pure science that these scientists went and created the modern IT revolution. Visions of ARPA, however, produced, as I said at the beginning of this year, under the auspices of Dominic Cummings, who is the Prime Minister's most powerful colleague, who also believes, in fact, who particularly believes that we should have pure science. So under his auspices, we then produce this report, Visions of ARPA, that says we also must have an ARPA. If only we had an ARPA, we too could have a Silicon Valley, completely ignoring the reality that it was the abolition of ARPA that gave, or rather the restriction of ARPA down only to applied work, that gave America the IT revolution. And so in the budget, we have 800 million for ARPA, and so that continues. The result is this: South Korea has the largest total research budgets in the world. This is completely forgotten. People think of South Korea as some backward country. South Korea spends more on R&D as a share of GDP, and they have a very high GDP, than any other country in the world. Number 2 is Taiwan. Number 3 is Japan. All these in the Far East. These countries, and it's not a coincidence, have the least government funding for R&D, i.e. there's no crowding out. All R&D is in the private sector. And because the state hasn't taken people out of the private sector, because the private sector is allowed to fund its own research without losing their best scientists to the state, they have almost twice as much funding for R&D in those Far Eastern countries as we do. But the other very important thing is the scientists where you want them. You want them in industry. When you have a crisis like this, you don't want to have to go to university scientists and get them to do research and then somehow translate that to industry and all the difficulties. You want industry to have its own scientists, and that's what happened in South Korea. Within a week of the government asking the biotech companies to produce a test, they had one, and they were able to stop the disease dead in its tracks. Now, the irony is that if you look at the English Industrial Revolution or the American Industrial Revolution, if you look at the growth of these two great industrial nations, we did it the way South Korea and Taiwan and Japan now are. We did not have the government funding of science. And contrary to myth, the French and the Germans did, and they never caught up with either Britain or America. So it was always under only privately funded R&D that the great economies took off. And if you do every test you want of the benefits of government-funded R&D, test after test produced by the OECD, by the American federal government itself, every time you test what happens when governments fund R&D, the consequence is not only no benefit, but actually a disbenefit because of the crowding out of funding. Because as you get more state funding, you get less industrial funding of science, and so the economy stutters. So to conclude, the South Koreans have copied our traditional model, which is why they're doing so well, whereas we now are now copying, and have been since 1957, the Soviet Union, and we're getting similar benefits. And to think that Boris Johnson, who lauds the idea of a British ARPA, Dominic Cummings, who is Boris Johnson, or Policy Exchange, which is basically the Conservative Party think tank at the moment, should pursue dreams of ARPA and neglect science of actual benefit to the British people is very, very sad. And my final point is this, and the tragedy is this: Barack Obama absolutely understood that we would be facing, as a globe, future pandemics. And he had created in the National Security Council a pandemic research unit, specifically to deal with the next pandemic. This is not great foresight. This is not saying, oh, no one could have imagined this. Just in the last decade, we've had Ebola, we've had MERS, we've had SARS, we still have AIDS. We're always getting new pandemics. And Obama had prepared for that in the National Security Council with the same sort of structures they have in places like South Korea and Taiwan. And Trump abolished it, not completely, there were still some people hanging around, but he completely degraded it, he decapitated it, he belittled it, and he stopped it doing what it should have done, which is what happened in South Korea and Taiwan. So there is actually, and I'm finishing now, a real lesson here. If you have the wrong model of science, which is the British and American model, where the purpose of society is to give money to scientists to work in, to use a cliche, ivory towers, doing work of no benefit to anyone, you'll end up with all the benefits of the Soviet Union. If you do what South Korea and Taiwan and Britain and America used to do, which is to say the job of industry is to fund science, and they do it very well, thank you very much, but the job of the state is to tap that science for particular missions, pandemic control, for example, then you get the best possible benefits. So what we need is a bit of growing up. We need to stop listening to visions. It's funny they use the word visions of ARPA. We should stop listening to visions, fantasies about if only the government gave us pure science, all would be well. We need to look at the hard empirical data, which is the role of the state is to minimize the burden on industry. Of course it is. To allow industry and encourage industry to do its own R&D, but a minimal state, but not a negligible state, to understand what really is a public good. And science in the service of, amongst other things, pandemic control is a very important public good, and that has been most cruelly neglected in the West, but not in the East.
Thank you very much, Terence. I think all of us read in the last few days some analysis on the success of South Korea, for example. And clearly the issue of testing came up a number of times in the media. But I think no one else has connected it with basically the source of science funding, which is what you're doing, right? So I wonder if you could elaborate on why the South Korean went in that direction. So and also you mentioned Sputnik and the fascination for the Soviet model, and in a sense, you know, a Cold War-like rush to the space. But is that enough to explain, you know, government funding in the West, or perhaps, you know, as some people would argue, you actually have market failures when it comes to R&D in plenty of areas?
Okay, let me answer this point. Your first question was, how come South Korea is doing what it's doing? Well, that is very simple. South Korea, but also Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, all these Far Eastern countries, they industrialized by copying. So in the early 50s and 60s and 70s, these countries didn't aspire to do research. It was enough for them simply to copy Western technology. And of course, in those days, before the WTO, it was very easy because patent rights were very loose in those days. And what happened to those Far Eastern countries? They discovered, almost by accident, look, just by copying America, Britain, Italy, Germany, France, whatever, we are making our own innovations. We are growing at a fantastic rate just by copying. And they decided not to discard the model that had worked so well for them. They knew what the British and the Americans were doing, but they said, we've actually got a better model and we're sticking to it. But you talk about Sputnik as if this is some fantastic thing. Pick up Visions of ARPA, published by Policy Exchange on January the 28th, 2020. And the first paragraph states, we are inspired by Sputnik. They actually state the original ARPA, I mean, the actual original ARPA was inspired by Sputnik, and we are inspired by ARPA because we want a new British ARPA. So the connection is very, very direct. But it's very interesting, this business of market failure, and it's a scam. What happened in 1957, the Russians said Sputnik, and the American government said, we want to copy the Soviet Union, but we have a problem. We don't want to admit the Soviet Union are right. We need a justification. for copying the Soviet Union. We need a market justification. And so they went to the Rand Corporation, which quite rightly has a rather dodgy reputation. And they said to the Rand Corporation, can you please produce for us highly impressive peer-reviewed papers in the economic literature written by highly impressive economists that we can claim market failure just in science, but nothing else, of course, because otherwise what will happen to the United States of America? And so Richard Nelson and Ken Arrow won a Nobel Prize, published these papers saying, markets are wonderful, except in science. There's terrible market failure in science. And the justification they used two justifications, and they're both utterly fictitious. One of them is that no one will ever do science within a market because science can always be copied. So if down the road there's a company doing molecular biology or plasma physics or something, I, Terence Kealey, can borrow their technology for nothing. Any fool can just go and copy someone else's technology. But of course, transparently, that's not true. Copying technology is very difficult, and the only way you can copy technology is by yourself doing so much science and research that you contribute into the pool of technology. And so science is not a public good, it's actually a contribution good. The only people who can benefit from other people's technology is those who contribute their own. And so you end up with a very strong incentive in a market to do technology. But the other justification was hilarious. I mean, it's actually quite funny unless you realize life is a bit of a tragedy. Nelson and Arrow said that by definition, if companies do research, then they get competitive edges over other companies. And therefore you don't have a perfect market. And since, as everybody knows, only perfect markets are really efficient, we have to stop companies from doing science. Only the government should do science so that all companies work to the same socialist model, so there's no unfair advantage, and then we'll get perfect distribution of wealth. I mean, this is so fantastic. One wonders how anyone could ever have taken it seriously. So we have been working to a false economic model for 80 years. So the question, therefore, is why? And the answer is there are 4 vested interests, and they all want the justification for the government funding of science. So scientists want it because it's so much nicer to work for other scientists in a nice ivory tower than to work for horrible people like investors or managers who might make you do something useful. Companies want government funded science because they see that as corporate welfare, and companies are very happy for other people to pay their science for them. Politicians like the government funding of science because they can, you're an Italian, they can strut around pretending they're Medici, great patrons of research. And finally, nationalists like the government funding of science because they think it will improve their defense expenditure and their power on the global stage. There is no vested interest, apart from the odd contrarian like you and me, Alberto, who don't believe that governments should fund science. And so you have a complete harmony of all vested interests. And under those circumstances, it's very hard for truth to emerge until, like a moment like we're witnessing today, you get the complete collapse of the Western economies because of this dreadful virus, because our economic model of science stopped us being prepared for it, that suddenly you realize that there is always a price to be paid for false economic models.
We have a number of questions, so I wanted to quiz you on our friend Mariana Mazzucato advising the Italian government, but I will abstain from that for the moment. And I'll start with a question from our friend Martin Cox. It's counterintuitive that a decrease in state funding of science causes an increase in total funding of science. So Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings could be forgiven for disagreeing with you. But is there some way to persuade them to change their mind?
Well, I think this virus is going to change a lot of minds, and it's completely counterintuitive because I'm afraid I don't forgive Dominic Cummings and I don't forgive Boris Johnson because the concept of crowding out is a very well-established concept, and the evidence in science is overwhelming. Every dollar or lira or euro or pound a government puts into science crowds out something like $3 or euros or lira or pounds. The evidence is so overwhelming. Even the OECD admits it, and it's an intergovernment agency, that crowding out, it may not be intuitive, but it's not so difficult a concept. Certainly, Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson should be able to understand a concept like crowding out. they, after all, in the main, rather skeptical about the state. The second half of your question is what will change? Oh, I think this virus is going to change a lot of things. Milton Friedman once said that it's only during crises that people re-examine the assumptions by which they work. And then the job of people like us is to put the ideas around on the table so that people in a crisis can look around for alternative ideas and think, oh, that's what we should do. So what we're doing here is putting on the table the idea, look, and you point out very correctly that I'm making a very clear link between government funding of science and non-government funding of science and benefits or not of the virus. We're putting on the table the reason South Korea, Taiwan, and all the other recent countries got it right is that industry funds science over there, and the job of the state is only to tap science in the national interest. And the reason we got it wrong is because we see the job of the state to support science, which is a very different analogy. And I think that in this crisis, people are going to say, why is it, Mr. Cummings, why is it, Mr. Johnson, that the very day after the South Korean government had mobilized the biotech industry to protect the people of South Korea, you wanted to tax the British people with almost $1 billion to support a group of scientists in a model that we know is false? I think there are going to be some tough questions.
We have two questions that are very similar, one by James Green and another one by our friend Matt Ridley. Writes Matt, did you discuss Germany? Was Germany's immediate use of the private sector in testing a consequence of a similar emphasis on private sector R&D, or just a matter of luck? And James Green likewise asked, how do you regard Germany's approach to containing the virus? It is just a similar approach to the UK one, but assisted by additional labs for testing. What are the key factors that kept their death rate so low? Is their industrial science approach any different from the UK?
Well, I'm afraid, and I think it's always best to be honest in these matters, I'm not an expert on what's happened in Germany. I just don't know. I ought to know more about Germany, but one thing I would say about Germany that I do know is they have a very large manufacturing sector, much larger manufacturing sector than we do, more analogous to the South Korean or Taiwan manufacturing sector. So they have much more private R&D. So to that extent, I think, but I'm going to be tentative here. I just don't know enough about Germany, so I'm sorry. But to the best of my understanding, they have a more South Korean type R&D landscape, and they have, I think I ought to stop there. Germany is not an area which I'm expert. It's a damn good question. I don't really know the answer, but with a much larger manufacturing base than we have, I suspect they have a much larger private R&D than we do, and therefore the government has more to tap. But rather than pontificate on matters I'm not an expert, I will stop there and thank them for a good question and promise that next time I'm asked that question, I'll know the answer.
Thank you for being candid about that. I think there may be plenty of interesting things to know and start to research about Germany. I mean, for example, one thing that people don't typically realize is the extent by which German hospitals are private. It's a lot of private hospitals up there. And when it comes to manufacturing, well, it could be. Certainly, one striking difference is the extent to which apparently Merkel listened to experts and in time, which may be a factor. James Green was also asking if you have any thoughts on what the outlook could be for the UK in the next 6 to 12 months.
Well, these are good questions. And again, I don't want to carry on admitting to ignorance, but honesty is more important. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm a biochemist, which is why I understood the South Korean speed with developing an RT-PCR test, as it's called, because this is within my area of professional competence. Where the future lies, of course, I know no more than anybody else who's dependent upon the epidemiologists. I will, however, say this. We don't know, of course, where the future lies. It may be that South Korea and Taiwan and all those other Far Eastern countries, in the end, will end up being swamped by the virus in the sense that until a vaccine comes, and only if such a vaccine is effective, will they be able to kill the virus dead. It may be that in a year's time, the virus would have caught up even there because it's inexorable. It'll always be there like a ship taking in water, however effectively the pumps work. However, this I will say, there is a famous saying, the race is not always to the swift, but that's the way to bet. And the wonderful thing about South Korea and Taiwan and the other Far Eastern countries, and also some other countries, New Zealand, is that these countries, they've allowed their policies to be determined by the best science. It's very obvious if you look at the way Boris Johnson in Britain or Donald Trump in America have behaved, is they have not prioritized the best science. I think they will from now on, but they certainly haven't as a baseline. And so I think what is going to happen, and I think a repositioning of science is already happening, we're going to end up with policies much more based on scientific evidence. Having said that, let us consider the way we deal with science in Britain. So there's a committee called SAGE, Scientific Advisory Committee. We don't know its members. We don't know what they say. It's treated as a state secret. This is no way to run science. If you look at, say, the Supreme Court, or you look at the Federal Reserve Bank or the Bank of England, you have a group of experts, they have different views, they publish their views, and then we move forward, whether it's making a judgment in a case or whether it's an interest rate. This is how science should operate. It is outrageous that science in Britain is treated as a state secret and that we just don't know what the government is being told. And it really shouldn't be limited to the executive, this information. We need to absolutely liberate immediately the official committees that give scientific advice. We should all hear it. We should hear the disputes. Some scientists are right and some scientists are wrong, just like in the Supreme Court, just like in the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. And we should have these views out there in the public tomorrow so that we as a society can work out for ourselves what we think and what is not happening, rather than allow us, particularly in Britain, the whole business to be treated as state secret. And therefore, in the hands of a group of politicians who really are not qualified to be making the decisions they've made. We've already had 2 U-turns in Britain, and because we went first from the containment phase to then we went to the phase when we were going to just let the virus rip, and now they're closing down. None of these seem to have been informed by any sense of long-term perspective of what was really going on. It was government ministers flying by the seat of their pants. This is very different from what was going on in South Korea, say, or Taiwan.
This goes very well, actually, to a point raised by Robert, who's obviously a reader of yours and knows, I think, your breakfast book, because he points out you're assuming that science and scientists are interested in the betterment of society as they make money. You know very well that is often not true. The food industry generates pseudoscience for its own benefit and to society's detriment. If there was no government funding, how would people like me be able to challenge them? Rob Lustig.
Oh, Robert Lustig, of course. By the way, I think everybody who's raised a question so far is a friend, so that's very, very nice, including Robert, of course. Well, the answer to that, of course, is very interesting. Robert is absolutely right. You cannot trust industrial science. The example I often use is the tobacco industry and the role of government there. And I always use this because it's such an unpleasant example that it's really quite memorable, which is, who was it who discovered that cigarettes cause lung cancer? And of all people, it was driven by Adolf Hitler. Of all people, Adolf Hitler. He came to power, he had an instinct that the tobacco industry had been misleading us all. He asked his we probably instructed his epidemiologist to find the evidence, and lo and behold, the Germans discovered that cigarettes cause lung cancer. The discovery was later attributed to Richard Doll in England because no one was reading the Nazi literature, and I'm glad they weren't. But the fact is, it was Hitler who did it. And even Richard Doll in England was funded by the government. So there is a real role for government science, not as it's currently constituted, to be corporate welfare to industry, but for government science to challenge industry, just as we want government science, by the way, to challenge the whole scope of society. Now, the only way you get that is if you fund science the way the Supreme Court is funded or the Bank of England is funded, i.e. money is delivered to these people, it's public money, but the mission is not to do what the executive tells you to do. The mission is to be completely open and transparent to the general public and to challenge a whole series of vested interests. At the moment, nobody is challenging vested interests. It's one of the great tragedies. And one vested interest that's not challenged is the scientists' false claims that governments need to fund them. No one challenges that interest. So I go along with Robert Lustig and say, basically, what we need now is we do need government-funded science, nothing like as big as we have, I suspect, but we do need it, but not as corporate welfare, but to challenge the many misconceptions that industries and other vested interests get away with.
We have a question from Facebook, from Lucinda.
Another friend.
Two of them. What role should and can the private sector play in Europe's exit strategy for COVID-19? So that's the first question. The second question is, can an increase in private higher education, pure research, play a role in future preparedness?
Well, let me take the second question first. If you look at the structures in Taiwan and South Korea particularly, they do already have, in fact, the one in Taiwan is called the Epidemic Command Center. It's practically a paramilitary operation. And there are public agencies in those two countries whose very role it is to plan for such future episodes, including how do we stop the lockdown, because that is a major problem. If you look at Barack Obama's unit within the National Security Council, it was absolutely devoted to planning for these events. So the future, I think, and you're talking to a man who believes passionately in the private sector, but I'm afraid I think the future in the next year or two absolutely lies with a combination between the state and the private sector. I'm not an anarchist. I believe there should be a state, but the role of the state is to protect society, not to pander to vested interest. What we now need is a dialogue between government and industry, but also the very best academics. And it should not be limited to a national stage. We live in a big world. There's some very, very bright scientists dotted all over the place. This should essentially be a global argument, a global discussion. It should be largely open. And it is, by the way. There's been a startling openness in the scientific literature on COVID-19. Almost every paper is not behind a paywall, which is a terrific thing. And we are now moving towards a much healthier situation by which governments and scientists can have a debate. The one group of people who are excluded from this are government scientists, either whether they're employed by governments or whether, like the SAGE committee in Britain, they work to the government. And all those dialogues should be opened up as well. This is not a national security matter like dealing with the Soviet Union. This is our security, and none of these conversations should be secret.
Now, we have three questions that I'll kind of bring together because they somehow challenge your narrative about Korea on well, not generally speaking, but on COVID-19. So one points out that it may well be, what about the hypothesis that in South Korea and some other Asian countries, things are going better basically because citizens are used to use face masks and widely use. There's another question, which is, you know, if you picture no SARS in 2003, isn't that likely that South Korea and Taiwan would have answered to COVID-19 like Europe? So isn't basically a memory of the previous epidemic. And last, a question which is based on the difference between Lombardy and Veneto. You know, we had an outbreak in Lombardy and Veneto, so two regions, one next to the other, I mean, both of them economically dynamic and internationally integrated. And the outbreak in Veneto was actually better control at first, and that changed everything. So Mario Dalco is asking, perhaps the difference is really about a different strategy of controlling the first outbreak and then channeling patients towards decentrated health facilities. I mean, keeping them home in as much as it is possible instead of concentrating them in hospitals. where of course you can have contagions among patients and doctors and nurses. So I think these 3 points on South Korea and Asia are interesting.
Right. Well, let me take these points on. I would be sympathetic to that argument that South Korea and other Asian countries, they're so close to China. China tends to be the source of all these zoonotic infections. They have a greater memory. I would be more sympathetic to that argument if it wasn't for Ebola and it wasn't for Barack Obama's response to Ebola. Barack Obama was, I think, an unusually intelligent person. And he set up the Pandemic Control Unit at the National Security Council essentially to be the globe's pandemic unit. He saw America as the essential nation, and he saw America as leading the world in, amongst other things, the control of pandemics. He was influenced, of course, by people like Bill Gates, whose foundation has done wonderful work in this area, and who, by the way, in a very famous TED talk just a few years ago, essentially predicted this outbreak with astonishing accuracy. It didn't require genius to expect that this outbreak would happen. You look at Bill Gates's TED talk, he obviously anticipates that America's economy will be demolished as is happening now. Barack Obama, who of course talked a lot to men and women like Bill Gates, absolutely took that on board and created the National Security Council Pandemic Unit to be the world's pandemic unit. And therefore, that memory did not need to be localized. It had been captured by the nation that sees itself as the world leader. And Trump's demolition of that unit is an international tragedy. Having said that, of course, there's a greater memory in the Far East and in the West, but as I said, Obama had picked up on that memory. Secondly, you talk about the different policies between the Veneto and Lombardy and contagion in hospital. Look, of course, different regions of the world are going to engage in different policies. It's one of the things that makes humanity learn. Something that Matt Ridley, who asked a question earlier, is always going on about, is that if you have different jurisdictions doing different things, you're more likely to acquire an understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And what we're now going to get into is undoubtedly different countries, Sweden's the classic example, are doing different things and they will have different outcomes. And at this point, because it's now too late for most countries, we're all much the same boat. We will all therefore do different things, and we'll have to see what works out, and we'll have to have a retrospectoscope. So you talk about face masks. I'm not an expert on face masks. I am told, I'm not an expert, that the real purpose of face masks is to stop you touching your own face if you put your hand somewhere else. Undoubtedly, there will be enough data for multivariate analyses in the future. We'll be able to work out which these different policies work best, and we will make a collective learning. The point is, and the key point is, Korea, Taiwan, and the other Far Eastern countries never got to that point. They stopped it. It might have been due to face masks, but I'd be very surprised. It's part of an intelligent approach. I'm sure the key was, and this is what I learned when I was a junior doctor 45 years ago from my Professor Besser, who absolutely taught me this. Doctors always test. The better the doctor, the more tests he or she performs on the patient, the better to monitor what is going on. That's what I learned from Mike Besser, and the lesson absolutely remains true. The South Koreans tested. We did not. And they therefore are not in our situation. We, on the other hand, are in our situation, and now we have to start from ground zero. They did not. So I reiterate that if you are intelligent from day one, rather than now at day 90, you start off with a much better situation.
Let's take a question from Diego Zuluaga, and then we go back to testing and the role of regulation in that. So ask Diego, if higher education goes fully online after COVID-19, which I hope it doesn't, but it's the same thing, and research moves to firms and maybe some research non-profit, then what would be left for universities as we know them to do? So that's a challenge for a former vice chancellor, isn't it?
Hello, Diego, another friend. Well, I don't think higher education will go online. But to answer your very interesting question, I would like to see higher education revert to how it used to be. Until relatively recently, universities saw themselves primarily as liberal arts colleges. They saw themselves primarily as teaching, because research can take place anywhere, but teaching can take place only within universities. But they also saw themselves in another key role, which is teaching scholarship, fostering scholarship, not research, but scholarship, which happens in libraries rather than in labs, and much, much cheaper. And therefore, challenging power, speaking truth unto power. President Eisenhower, in his leaving address, is a very sober document. Eisenhower was the man who gave us ARPA. Eisenhower was the man who created the government funding of science in America. But in his leaving address, he basically said, mea culpa, this was a mistake. This is the famous science industry complex, the famous industrial military complex, science military industrial complex that he bitterly regretted having created. And what he says in this leaving address is, we have destroyed the university as a center of freedom of thought. The document is amazing. We have destroyed the university as a center of challenge to government. We have destroyed the university as an originator of original thought. One of the reasons we had this proliferation of think tanks in the last 50 years is that universities have been bought by the government. It's very difficult in a university to say the government's wrong, because immediately people point out that the university is being funded by the government. Even if it's just science being funded by the government, there are things called overheads, and some of the grants, as much money is in overhead as in the actual direct grant, and that goes to fund the libraries and the sports facilities and all the other things a university does. So even independent universities like Harvard have become completely captured by government funding. We've lost the university as a center of education primarily, and as a center of challenge to government. So yes, let's stop funding the universities and let them revert to what they should be doing, which is centers of scholarship and criticism, and let research migrate to where it should be, primarily industry.
On this matter, there's another question from Matt Ridley. If you can comment on the dependence of universities on Chinese money these days.
Well, I think it's a jolly good question. By the way, I don't want to sound patronizing, so I do not wish to sound patronizing, but these are all jolly good questions. I think we should withdraw a lot from China. I mean, not just Chinese money to British universities or Western universities. I think the Western world should retreat very significantly from China. This is a wider geopolitical point. I'm no longer speaking to my area of competence. I'm now speaking purely as an individual. And of course, I could be wrong. These are subjective matters. But the Western world admitted China to the WTO in the hope that we would then integrate China within a democratic market world, and therefore China would become a more civilized country. The people of China are obviously excellent people. I mean, we all know Chinese people, and as individuals, clearly these are people like us. But the Chinese government is a horrible government. And what the WTO admission has done is it has reinforced the power of the Chinese government. And I think it's been catastrophic. China is a major world threat. Its total GDP now equals America's, but of course it's growing at a much faster rate, and it's a much bigger country. China represents a big problem to the civilized world. And I think that we should stop making ourselves vulnerable to China. One of the things is every time you criticize the Dalai Lama, the Chinese ambassador, if you're a government, the Chinese ambassador comes around and threatens withdrawal of all sorts of Chinese access to markets and all the rest of it. We should stop making ourselves vulnerable to China. I think we're dealing with a situation like, something like 1933 in Europe. We have got to stop pandering to China. I would certainly stop any form of dependence on China. And that, of course, includes not just universities, but also supply chains and all the other things that China can hold to threaten us with. China's a threat. Until they become a democracy, we should be very cautious in our dealings with them.
Let's not get carried away. We do have a couple of questions that are, so to speak, science related, and I'd like you to answer those. But before that, since you mentioned WTO, one question is, what do you think is going to be the role of the WTO going forward?
Well,
WHO, I'm sorry, I misread it. Do you agree that their response to this epidemic has been very poor? And of course, I mean, WHO has been subject of strong criticism, particularly by the American administrations these days.
Well, the WHO, of course, panders to China, and therefore that is a reason why people criticize them. Actually, the WHO, if you look objectively at what they did. They declared a pandemic and they declared a situation of great crisis very early on. I think objectively you can't really criticize the WHO. You can criticize them for being over polite to China, but then they live in the real world. Don't forget Trump is a populist. And the whole point of being a populist is you never take responsibility for your own actions. It's always someone else's fault. And at the moment, the World Health Organization is a very useful whipping boy. I think the answer is we have to strengthen the WHO because we live in a global world, and germs and microbes and viruses can hop on airplanes like anyone else, and we have to integrate our health response to them. So let us strengthen the WHO. Let's point out that the most successful country of all was Taiwan, which is the one country not in the WHO. I think we have to stop pandering to China like this. I think we have to readmit Taiwan to the world of independent nations. They're obviously better than we are at many of these things. We should strengthen the WHO, and we should stop allowing Trump to blame the WHO for his own grievous and horrific mistakes. I cannot think of a world leader who's been consistently more stupid in the face of this virus, except perhaps Bolsonaro in Brazil, than Donald Trump.
Now, let's go to two questions that are instead science related, so to say. One is, any thoughts on why the Oxford team is ahead of UK Biotech in the development of a vaccine? So that's a question. And the other one is about asymptomatic carriers. They are not being monitored. Nobody knows what proportion of infected people they represent. And it's difficult to see, you know, it's difficult to understand, at least for us, how long they're going to stay infected. So on the one hand, why Oxford is doing better than Biotech in the UK in as far as developing a vaccine, and on the other hand, what shall we be doing about asymptomatic carriers of the virus?
Right, well, asymptomatic carriers of the virus, take the second question first. South Korea has shown us the example. I mean, from the middle of February, South Korea had testing sites dotted around the country based on Starbucks, based on McDonald's. Anyone could drive up and they were completely free. And because South Korea had so many biotech companies, by the end of February, they had 4 different tests from 4 different biotech companies, all of whom were producing tests in very large numbers. South Korea has allowed everybody and anyone to be tested from the end of February. You know, we're now in April. Here we are, end of April. 2 months later in the West, we're way behind. So South Korea has allowed anyone to test, which means that South Korea has long known who these carriers are and has been able to isolate them. Taiwan, the same story. So the answer is, I'm afraid we have to gear up our testing. In Britain, for example, it was only on April the 1st, I have no idea why it was so late, it was only on April the 1st that the British government approached the British biotech sector and said, would you please scale up testing facilities? The British government had actually an early test, but they hadn't scaled it up on an industrial scale. So we've got to catch up with the South Koreans and do the same. We've got to realize that the future here lies in the private sector, which has the capacity for mass production. As for Oxford, look, Stanford created a very exciting thing called a science park years and years ago now, out of which we have Silicon Valley. Oxford and Cambridge, by the way, and many other universities, very sensibly copied that model. Well, there's a thing called stochastic events. I mean, someone was going to come up with a vaccine first, and it happens that it was Oxford. But if some atom bomb had dropped on Oxford 2 months ago and there was no Oxford, I can assure you it would have been Stanford or Harvard or Cambridge a few weeks later. These are all top scientists, or it could have been Paris or Milan. This would have come out eventually. Oxford has a very good science park. So has Cambridge, so has Stanford. It would have come out of one of those science parks. It's a stochastic event.
Speaking again about South Korea, Matthew Finney is asking how much of the South Korean success can be attributed to differences in attitudes about surveillance and privacy policy. The South Korea COVID-19 app seems to have been widely used and rather effective. So once again, it's a cultural difference. I mean, in a sense, you know, on a continuum, attitudes about funding science, face masks, privacy, I mean, is all of it a package of different cultural attitude? That's my
yeah. I've read Matthew Feeney's essay on the Cato website, and it's a very good essay. It is astonishing what's happened in South Korea and again in Taiwan. In Taiwan, they call it the electronic wall. Basically, they have used every modern piece of technology to, first of all, trace, then monitor, and then isolate carriers. So essentially what happens, if you're identified by the authorities in somewhere like South Korea or Taiwan or those other Far Eastern countries, once you're identified, you are forced by law to self-isolate. And then to make sure you do not leave your apartment, you have to at all times carry a cell phone and, because of course people can just leave cell phones behind, a wristband or an ankle band, so that using Bluetooth, if you leave your cell phone behind, they know you've moved. So the whole point is you are not allowed to move. And this is every 5 minutes, the information is updated thanks to a GPS, which is associated with all this technology. On top of that, in an astonishing openness that we find extraordinary, anyone is allowed to know where every single carrier is. The name isn't released, but you are told, look, there's a 60-year-old woman living in 24 Halliburton Road. She has got COVID-19. She went to Sainsbury's last week, this Sainsbury's. We know she went to that shop the week before, and we know she lives in this street. If you want, you might avoid those areas. No name is released, but the degree of information release has been fantastic. On top of that, the government integrates within that knowledge about credit card use and debit card use and what cameras are revealing about people's movements. Now, we would consider that an appalling intrusion on our freedom. But what they have, and this is your point in a sense, Alberto, they have a different culture. First of all, they trust their own government. It must be rather nice to live in a country where people trust their government. I don't know why they manage it and we don't, but they trust their government. But second, it's a very straightforward deal. If you go along with these intrusive measures of surveillance, you don't close down your economy. If you have our system where you don't track, you close down the economy. It's pretty obvious which is the better option. So the Taiwanese and all the rest of them out in the Far East have made a very shrewd judgment. Let's use every technology we can. Let's protect personal privacy to the degree of not releasing names, but let's not protect personal privacy to the extent that carriers can damage other people. I think they got it right, but I do agree it is a different culture.
Well, you know, sometimes you wonder if you can trust your own government with this kind of information. So that's a separate thing. Now, three questions that are similar. So one thing is I think a very important question, which is what is stopping the West from rolling out testing as South Korea? Then another question is do South Korea and Taiwan have different FDA equivalents that put fewer barriers to new tech? Richard Tran asks. And then Massimiliano Trovato asked, it's been reported that in the US, the availability of testing was actually delayed by FDA regulation. I'd be interested in your thoughts on government regulation rather than funding of science in the context of a pandemic, when time is clearly of essence.
Well, these are, of course, as ever, very, very good questions. To take the second question from Richard Tren first, the equivalent of the CDC, in fact, it's called the Korean CDC. It's got the same name. The CDC, which in Korea leads on the accreditation process, was accrediting the new tests within 24 hours. The Korean government, on the January the 27th, they called together all the biotech companies, promised them immediate accreditation. And so the accreditation procedures took place within 24 hours in Korea and Taiwan, which is an extraordinary speed. I am not an expert on what happened with the FDA in America, but there seems no doubt from what I have read in the newspapers. So now I'm no longer talking about narrow professional competence, just what the news that I have that everyone else has, that the FDA did not respond with proper urgency. However, let me explain why I think that might be. As early as January the 30th, the South Korean president was saying, this is a national emergency. There was still only a handful of cases. This is a national emergency. We have to intrude on the freedom of our citizens in ways that are not particularly friendly to human rights and liberties, but there's a greater concern which is stopping this virus. And therefore, he galvanized the state sector to respond to the need of the virus. Compare that to Boris Johnson or Donald Trump, who for something like 2 months minimized the risk of the virus, boasted about shaking hands and taking pregnant girlfriends to rugby matches in the middle of March, or collecting together vast crowds in the Midwest saying it was all fake news and just democratic publicity to try to stop him getting re-elected. There was no pressure from...
Well, you know, even in France, they allowed people gathering in a gigantic convention of persons dressed up, or better say, color like Smurfs. So it's not just Trump. I mean, Emmanuel Macron has been no better.
Well, but compare that to other political leaders. I mean, people make this point, and I don't know how true it is, but in the main, apparently, I am told, women leaders have been much more conscientious and thoughtful than male leaders, I am told. Certainly, it is certainly true that New Zealand has done extraordinarily well, and clearly Germany has done very well, and one could continue. But the point is, there was no political pressure from the top in countries like Britain and the United States to facilitate these tests, and therefore the federal agencies and equivalents in other countries neglected the need to move as quickly as they did. So this illustrates the role of both an effective state following an effective model. An effective model means an effective state that is small but focused on what needs to be done properly, in this case, tapping the R&D capacities of the biotech sector. So to come back to the first question, why not test? I think the answer now has become logistical. I think that now the whole world has this condition. So many billions of people need testing. I think we have quite simply run out of reverse transcriptase and polymerase chain reaction technologies. And I think it has just become logistic. These are not complicated tests. An RT-PCR test could be done by any second-year molecular biology undergraduate.
Can you explain that, you know, in simple language for non-scientists? But it's interesting, I think, to get a sense of the feasibility of the test. I mean, what does it take?
Well, there are two tests, of course. There's the antibody test, if you had it in the past, and then there's the RT-PCR test. Well, it's an RNA virus, and so RT means reverse transcriptase. So you extract from the nose or wherever it is you think your virus is. You extract, you concentrate down the RNA, and then you put in an enzyme called reverse transcriptase, which turns the RNA into DNA, and then you do what's called the polymerase chain reaction, where you have one chain of DNA, and then after a series of reiterated cycles, you now have 1 million chains of DNA, which are relatively easy, in fact, very easy under those circumstances to detect. The difficulty, curiously, doesn't lie in the RT-PCR in the main. Those are fairly straightforward technologies. The difficulty lies in the clinical side. You've got to avoid false positives and false negatives. So there has to be scrupulous application to absolutely every detail. So it does require very high quality clinical laboratories, but these are just matters of logistics. There's nothing intellectually challenging here.
Okay. And about Massimiliano's point on the FDA and the role of regulation in a crisis like this.
Well, the role of regulation in a crisis like this is to be galvanized, to do what is necessary to ensure you don't let through tests. And there are slightly different tests because different RT-PCR technologies are focused on different parts of the RNA virus. But you have to make sure that the level of sensitivity is sufficient, that you don't get false negative, and you also have to make sure that the level of accuracy is sufficient, you don't get false positives. That is the role of the FDA or CDC or whichever regulatory body you have. But in a crisis, these things can happen very, very quickly. It would appear they did not in America. It appeared that they did in the East.
Another question on the United States. Does the fact that the US has some public funding for science mean that corporately funded science in America was insufficient to develop tests quickly as did the South Koreans? Or does the spread of the virus in the United States have more to do with a certain degree of governmental clumsiness in responding to early indications that problems were coming. So corporate funded science in the US was inefficient when it comes to developing test capability.
Well, the South Korean biotech sector is huge. I mean, I don't think people realize how huge science is in South Korea. They're spending almost twice as much, well, more than twice as much actually, as the EU or the OECD on R&D. I mean, it's an extraordinary difference. Their biotech sector is enormous. So because they don't have public funding of science, they have a huge private sector because, of course, they're an industrial nation. But the other side of it, you're quite right, there are two sides to this, is governmental drive. I have absolutely no doubt that if Barack Obama had been president in America, we would not have abolished the pandemic unit in the National Security Council. I was talking to a molecular biologist the other day who said, look, when this happened, this is a Harvard scientist, when this happened, I picked up the phone and talked to one of my colleagues in China. It is extraordinarily mysterious to me. I presume the American embassy in South Korea and Taiwan and all these other places have a science attaché. I assume the British government have a science attaché in their embassy. I assume the French and the Italians have science attachés in their embassies. Why were these attachés not reporting back home, look, South Korea is galvanizing itself against this new virus? I think the answer is they probably did report back. There were no secrets to what was going on in those countries, but there was a complacency, almost a decadence to the way the West assumed that somehow they would be immune from these problems. Barack Obama, Bill Gates, some of the most impressive men in the world, and Bill Gates, he may not be perfect, but these are not frivolous or trivial people. These men and women absolutely anticipated the next pandemic. Had they been in charge, it would have been a very different story. Unfortunately, we had Trump.
I shall mention briefly that lots of stress on pandemic risk was also put by George W. Bush. So you have a bipartisan record when it comes to United States president. A question from Marco Valerio Loprete, who deals a lot with demographics issues. So he's asking, according to a few analysts, demographics played a role at the beginning of the outbreak of coronavirus. In South Korea, for example, the outbreak was concentrated among the members of a young religious group. Something similar happened in Germany, where someone talked of a skiers epidemic, referring to mostly young tourists that went to Austria for skiing, basically. That also lowered mortality. Could that have played a role in shaping the response? And in general, are aging societies more fragile in the face of pandemics?
Well, let me take the middle question on the religious group. Well, first of all, you're quite right about George W. Bush. This isn't a generic attack on the Republican Party. This is an attack on this particular administration. Of course, there were some very strange practices amongst some of the religious groups, particularly in South Korea, who were obviously in total denial in the early stages of what was going on. And we know, and there have been since apologies, that one or two religious groups in in South Korea, really did behave very strangely, almost purposefully denying, as I said, the existence of this threat. But there was a very rapid education process. So yes, again, we have a stochastic process. There's always going to be a group somewhere that has to start the thing off. I mean, who would have thought it would be Lombardy of all places? There is a degree of stochastic chance to where these things originate, but then of course the thing becomes more global. So I would say that once the virus is going to spread, yes, of course, there's certain areas which are less cautious than others, where they engage in practices that are more pro-viral, and so that's where things are going to happen. Whether older societies are more susceptible to pandemics is a question, I'm afraid, would have to be asked of an epidemiologist. This is outside my area of professional competence.
Okay, so I mean, in Italy, of course, was quite striking because we are quite an old society, and the virus has been particularly bad, clearly, for people over a certain age. So a side question, so you don't think that if and when we're thinking about reopening the economy, there should be a restriction for people based upon their age?
Well, forget restrictions. Let individuals take great responsibility for their own care. It doesn't matter what the government's doing. If, let's say, tomorrow, or let's say you live in Sweden, where obviously there are relatively few restrictions. If I was an over 70-year-old in Sweden, I would be taking extreme precautions to minimize my exposure to other people. Because, of course, this particular virus, I mean, it wasn't true of Spanish flu. Different viruses have different groups that they attack. But this particular virus seems to attack preferentially, as we all know, the old and people who already have some condition going wrong with them. Those people, whatever happens, should be very careful when lockdown is released. Of course, every country that has locked down is very, very worried about how to reverse the lockdown. The real anxiety will be, okay, so you flatten the curve, to use the famous cliche. Does that mean that when you stop locking down, you will then get a revival of the virus? The answer is we don't know. And one of the advantages of different jurisdictions is that different countries will do different things. And so next time round, we'll know better. And there is no simple answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think anyone knows. All I can say, and here I'm repeating myself endlessly, if from day one you operated under a really intelligent regime, both of government and science, you are in a much better situation than you've ended up. However, I now think that we're all in the same boat, except for those who never got it, like Taiwan or New Zealand. And in a sense, we are all in this together at this point, and we will share experiences. And individual countries will open schools, others will open shops, whatever, and we'll see how it goes. It's going to be tricky reversing the lockdown, but one of the concerns, and John Ioannidis in Stanford is one of those who pointed this out very early, one of the great dangers of lockdown is in the end, you end up not actually reducing the total number of cases. You just have destroyed the economy. And that would be heartbreaking because the economic damage has clearly ruined millions upon millions of lives.
Yes. Two questions that are related exactly with these. So how we're going to be staying in this all together. So some financial media and Donald Trump, and clearly, I mean, a business interest, largely speaking, seem to be hyping up the possibility of an early return to normality, facilitated by some discovery of antiviral drugs or an early development of vaccine. How realistic is this expectation?
I think pretty poor. I mean, Mr. Donald Trump believes that hydroxychloroquine is going to save everyone's life, and it clearly isn't. And it's too easy to sell snake oil or to clutch at hopes. I mean, you've only got to go back to medieval times, because of course we've had plagues since the beginning of the Neolithic period, to see that people do invent fantastic explanations for getting out of these things. I think that we will get a vaccine. That's my assumption. I think it will take much longer than we would all like. The concern is, of course, that the vaccine might, in some cases, make things worse. As we all know, the immune system, and we know that what kills, we think we know that what kills people in this condition is not the actual viral infection as such, it's the immune reaction. And so this, of course, makes the whole business of a vaccine doubly dangerous. What if the vaccine in some way accelerates the immune reaction, at least in some people? That would be a nightmare. So it's not going to be straightforward developing a vaccine. As for antiviral drugs, as for example we have in AIDS, we're dealing with 7 billion people. And these antiviral drugs in AIDS, you have something to monitor. So in AIDS, it's a bit like testing. You have you do blood tests. We're not going to get into the details here. It's not necessary. You do blood tests, you monitor the rise of certain things in people's bloods, and then you put in the antiviral drugs. This is a luxury that will be denied 7 billion people getting COVID-19. So I personally can't see antiviral drugs coming in a hurry, and I personally can't see a vaccine coming in a hurry. So I don't think the medium-term prognosis is particularly great, but it may be that once we've got to the curve and then we withdraw the lockdown, it may be that we'll be very lucky. I think we deserve some luck. I really hope we'll be lucky. But I think anyone who makes any firm predictions at this point is making a mistake, because you can't make predictions. I will make only one generic prediction. This is a time for the most intelligent governments and the most intelligent scientists in the most open way to collectively share information and intelligence. And the quicker we move to that, the better. And the less we have politicians, okay, you're defending Mr. Trump all the time. Let me talk about Mr. Bolsonaro. The fewer Bolsonaros we have, the better.
Well, a question again about politics. Is religion playing a nefarious role in Iran too? Well, Iran has been clearly a center of infection. It's not very clear, at least to me, how the Ayatollahs are playing with it.
Well, I'm certainly not going to attack religion. Whether you have a theocratic state in Iran that is managing the virus badly, that is certainly within the bounds of possibility. One would almost go so far as to say, I'd be surprised if they didn't handle the virus badly. But whether that's because they're theocratic or because they have other concerns, I don't know. No, I mean, obviously, this is a time when religion for millions and millions of people is a source of great comfort. I don't know how religious people are handling the closure of the churches. My guess is that for many, many people, the closure of the churches has been a great sadness. And of course, for those people, I share their regret. I understand, however, that the churches in the main are being technologically very adept and are reaching out to their congregations in other ways. I would not in any way whatsoever blame religion for this problem.
Well, at the very same time, speak about Iran and similar situation. I don't know if you remember William McNeill, Plagues and People book. I mean, one of the theses of the book is that you got this difficult balance between microparasites and macroparasites, of course, being ruling classes and governments. And sometimes, microparasites may swipe away the macroparasites. It happened before in history.
Well, there have been 3 times in history: the Italian city-states of the high medieval period, the Dutch provinces in the 17th century, and then England, and then the other countries that followed from England in the 18th century, where ruling elites have come together to crush parasites. These are very rare historic examples. So you're right, most of the time, parasites, as in that South Korean film, are in menace.
That's an interesting question about the Angela Merkel background as a scientist. Do you think it helped her in managing this?
My instinct, of course, I am a scientist, but my instinct is it would have made a big difference. Mrs. Thatcher, remember, was also a scientist, and it changed the way she. I think it's much easier for people. I mean, this may sound like special pleading, and I must be careful not to, but I think it's much easier for scientists to simply look at the data and say, well, this is what we must do. I find that intuitively easy. So I would back the suggestion that Angela Merkel being a scientist was a good thing. That doesn't mean I think that everybody should be a scientist. The Soviet Union famously was run by engineers for 70 years, and that did not end well. But I think having a few scientists around would be a good thing.
Now, there's a question which is about IP. I think you like that. Do you think that patents and copyrights inhibit the creative process by discouraging the exchange of information? Now, I know you do, but we like to elaborate on that.
Well, I feel very strongly that patents and IP are a conspiracy. Intellectual property is theft, to adapt a famous phrase. The exception is in pharmaceuticals. The cost of generating a new drug, because of all the regulatory costs, which are appropriate, by the way, you've got to have safety, is such that it's too easy to copy. But patents, remember, are a survival from the medieval period. Patents were invented in the era of monopoly capitalism, specifically to maintain monopolies, which is the whole point of patents. And the other point of patents is to take pressure off the patent holder, because he or she doesn't have to do research anymore because they have a monopoly. So if you don't have patents, you end up with much more research, as companies will compete with each other perennially. Patents aren't a scandal. However, in this particular case, I can't see patents being a particular problem, coming up with new tests. I mean, I think it would be very easy, if there is an issue, for governments to simply declare a patent or a patent holiday. So, for example, to illustrate this with a historical example, in 1917, when the United States of America declared war on Germany, it had no aviation industry because the Wright brothers' patents had simply crushed the American aviation industry. And within a matter of days, President Wilson declared what he called a patent pool, which is essentially a patent holiday, and the American aviation industry took off. If, God forbid, there would be patent or IP problems with a patent test, with a COVID-19 test, I can't believe that any government in this climate would allow that to stop development or use of such patents for more than about 1 minute. It certainly shouldn't be allowed to happen.
Then let's move to one last question, perhaps, a couple more, because we're taking a lot of your time and we're very grateful. It's been
I'm enjoying myself.
Greatly stimulating. A question from Martin. Presumably, governments have to have some companies to turn to in a crisis if things are to work along the lines they follow in South Korea. Does this imply that public interest considerations should lead governments to support domestic firms, or can they rely on multinational companies?
That's a very profound question. And we don't want to live in a world where every country is hermetically sealed against every other. We certainly want to live in a world where ideas can flow fluently. But I think we've seen by all the fights over PPE, personal protection equipment, and masks and exports and imports of these things, that when people face a threat to their very existence, they expect the nation state to look after them. So I think the answer to that is that there should be, I think it is the role of governments to ensure, and this goes against the entire globalization movement of the last 30, 40 years, a sufficient domestic capacity. After all, if you look, for example, at British agricultural policy since the war, we have pursued a policy of maintaining an agricultural sector totally irrationally in view in terms of economics, but just in case we end up in a military situation, we want self-sufficiency in food. So I think it would be, to answer your question, it's a good question, I wasn't expecting it. I think you could make a very good geopolitical case to maintain sufficient domestic capacity to address any particular possible threats in the future without denying the fact that we all live in a global world and we all want to be friends with our neighbors.
Well, Terence, that's a bit difficult, analytically speaking, because, of course, I mean, your whole argument against state funding of science is based upon, as you mentioned, the 4 interest groups that capture government funding. And, of course, you got plenty of interest group in agriculture, too. I mean, one of the reasons why we do have the common agriculture policy in the EU is because we have very good lobbyists that do pretty well in assuring lots of money is going to farmers. So I think it could be a slippery slope. And at the same time, you know, when you think about, let's put it this way, non-manufacturing countries, if not poorer countries altogether, it would be very difficult for them to have a good domestic supply of things that are actually quite complex to develop as pharmaceuticals. I mean, I don't expect particularly poorer countries to, to have domestic production of anything that complex.
You are, of course, right. And you and I are speaking exactly the same language. We both understand the caveats that each of us is under. And of course, politics ultimately becomes a matter of art and judgment. I mean, one of the reasons why the Europeans are coming together in the European Union is to ensure that a nation of 300 million of the most sophisticated in the world will basically be self-sufficient in almost anything they might need, apart from the odd commodity that's not actually produced, like zinc or something in Europe, while at the same time having a free market. And we can see why Europe is doing this. The United States of America is such another example. Your points are totally valid. You understand where I'm coming from. I understand where you're coming from. These become matters of judgment. But in all other things being equal, one would want to be self-sufficient in everything of geopolitical importance. We have armies that are strictly national for obvious reasons. If it turns out that for geopolitical reasons, each country needs a biotech industry in which it can rely, or a face mask industry, well, then that's just how the world works.
When it comes to face mask, I think it would be interesting to see more study about regulation, because clearly, if you think about Italy, Italy is a hugely is an important manufacturing country. It's the second in Europe when it comes to manufacturing after the Germans. And of course, one of the big things in Italy is clearly fashion, all kind. And the face mask it's quite a simple product. I mean, we're not talking about a vaccine. We're talking about quite a simple product. But we do have evidence of huge messes in public procurement. And nowadays, we do have the government that basically wants to put a political price of a face mask, which of course will make far more difficult and far less convenient for a cornucopia of Italian businesses, mostly small, but quite effective on average, to get into the production of face masks. I mean, it's face masks are not like ventilators, which are quite a complex thing to adapt your machineries to make. It's a very simple product, and you can picture companies turning almost overnight into that kind of production if they're properly mobilized, as you pointed out, but also if you're not making it impossible for them basically to switch their production with rules, which happens in plenty of areas.
Look, Alberto, we need smaller states, but the things that they do, they need to do properly. The direct correlation between state efficiency and corruption, or the converse, is very, very tight. We know that Scandinavian countries or New Zealand are beautifully run because their political class is honest. We all know what happens in the Mediterranean. We don't have to go into it.
I have to say, they're also small country population-wise, which helps. I mean, it's much easier to have lots of civic trust and reliable institution and accountability if you are a 10 million people country than if you are a 60 million country, if you're not German. Course.
Well, the Germans will, but the other thing is that there is such a thing as, obviously we're moving beyond the term of the debate now, but there is such a thing as devolution, and actually Italy's touched on that, but America certainly could have done this. I mean, if you look at Canada, 2/3 of all government money in Canada is raised and spent at the provincial level, the provinces. Huge devolution because, of course, the problems of the French and the English speakers, and to which the solution is devolution. We could all devolve much more. There's a man in England called Simon Jenkins who's banging on about this, but he was probably right. Britain is a hugely centralized country. We could have had much more devolution. And I suspect devolution is one answer to this complicated problem.
That's amen to that. There is a question I left behind, also because it relates to a very British matter, and I think we may finish with this. What are your thoughts on the reasons behind keeping the SAGE advice in the UK a secret? Is this a situation reflected in other countries?
I don't know about other countries, but it's an absolute scandal. SAGE advice, obviously, no one who's on, about 80 scientists on SAGE, there are a number of different committees. We know the names of only 2 of them. Out of 80 scientists, we know the names of 2. And we don't know a single word that they got offered in advice. This actually is a scandal. It's a strong word to use. I would call it a scandal. Any scientist on SAGE who does not want his or her words to be released should be asked to stand down, and SAGE should release minutes within 24 hours of each meeting. After all, if Supreme Court justices or members of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England can make individual statements and stand by them, scientists jolly well can. And we have to stop this culture of the executive in England grossly monopolizing science. Science belongs to us all. The scientists should account to the public and to the legislature as well as to the executive. We need a complete change of culture. The trouble is this: scientists in Britain have for so many years prostituted themselves to government, begging for government money because it's in their own private interests, that they have sacrificed far too much. It's time scientists stood up for themselves and said, we have to be treated properly and we have to treat ourselves properly. SAGE is secret, it's owned by the government as a sort of pet pussycat. It's got to stop.
I think with these vigorous words, we should really thank you, Terence. It's been hugely stimulating. And we may pester you again in the future for another discussion. When and if perhaps more evidence and more information come up, and hopefully, sometime soon we may resume meeting in person, but it may not happen in the next couple of months, I fear. So,
well, that would be lovely.
Thank you very much indeed for your time and for this hugely interesting conversation.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Abbiamo ora, ringraziandovi tutti veramente per la partecipazione a questo seminario, annunciamo un altro seminario che avrà luogo invece domani alle ore 15:30. Sarà con noi Lorenzo Binismaghi, oggi presidente di Société Générale e a lungo nel board della Banca Centrale Europea, economista, molto presente nel dibattito di questi giorni, e con lui parleremo dell'Italia e del MES domani alle 15:30. Grazie davvero per la vostra attenzione e per essere stati con noi.